Welcome to the sixth lecture in the Fundamentals of Business Analysis course. In this lecture, we're going to be covering the third phase of Seventh Morning's RDM model, finalizing requirements. I will say that we've covered a tremendous amount of material so far. By now, you should have a good understanding of requirements in general, how they're gathered and documented, we call that forming requirements, and how they are analyzed and modeled, we call that transforming requirements. After going through these phases in a project, you have a mostly solid and coherent body of requirements. This next phase, finalizing requirements, is, well, it's just what it sounds like. It's taking the solid requirements that you have and getting them to a point where they are baselined or frozen. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about three related topics that will help you get to that baseline state. In order to finalize requirements, you have to present them to your stakeholders. Maybe you're in the tiny minority of organizations that don't require this. You just email requirements documents out to your stakeholders, they approve them, and you get on with design and development. But that's pretty rare. And so presenting requirements is a key skill for BAs, and one we'll cover in depth. Additionally, we'll discuss the process for gathering approvals from your stakeholders. Pretty much all the work you've done by this point is leading up to getting those approvals, and it's important to take it to that final step. Finally, we'll wrap up the lecture with some guidelines for prioritizing requirements. So let's talk about presenting. I assume that a lot of us don't really have much real experience in presenting to audiences. Perhaps you're new to the world of professional work, or perhaps you come from a role that didn't require you to present information to people. Presenting in general is probably too big of a topic for a course in business analysis, but I will give you 10 tips here. Okay, tip number 1, it's your attitude. Attitude is key. Your attitude going into your presentation will largely determine how your audience perceives your presentation. If you have the right attitude, things will probably go smoothly. If not, well, it's less certain. I'd love to tell you that you need to have a particular attitude, but in reality, it should vary depending on the type of organization you're in, the type of project you're working in, the participants in the presentation, and a number of other factors. What I'll suggest is that you figure out what the right attitude should be and write it down using 3 adjectives. For example, calm, cool, and collected, or down-to-earth, inspirational, and fun. Another related tip is to validate that attitude with your project manager or boss before the presentation. I remember planning presentations several times with my own former boss and saying something like, okay, boss, we're going into this presentation with such and such senior person in the organization. I think I need to come across as authoritative, solution-oriented, and optimistic. Do you think that's right, or am I missing something? And then she would give me some good advice along those lines. Overall, manage your attitude, because success or lack of success will follow. All right, tip number 2. Your audience is the point, not the material. There is a tendency among new presenters to get really focused on the material. You know, you might be thinking, okay, I've got 147 requirements to cover, and I need to show these 6 models, and everyone in the room needs to understand them and approve them. Well, okay, hold up. You're missing the point. The point is not your 147 requirements, it's your audience. You know, what if you gave that perfect presentation with 147 requirements and described those 6 models, but there was nobody in the room? Well, it wouldn't really be a presentation. No, your audience is what makes it a presentation. So focus on them instead. If you focus on them, they'll notice and pay attention and contribute. If you focus too narrowly on your material, they'll get bored, they'll lose focus, and they'll start paying attention to their phones and email. So pay attention to your audience. Tip number 3 is actually one of the most foundational elements of good presentations and good presenters. Know your audience. What this means is that since your audience is the point, we need to understand them and tailor our presentations to them. So before you walk into the conference room or get on the conference call, think about your audience. Do they already know the material somewhat, or are they new to the project? Are they technical or non-technical? Are they senior in the organization or junior? How is their grasp of the language you are speaking? Are they new to the organization or company veterans, etc.? There are a million different categories that you can employ. The best bet is really to think about this beforehand and plan accordingly. But despite that, you need to think on your feet also, and that's tip 4. Monitor your audience. Pay attention to them as you present. Are they keeping up with the material, or are they getting confused? Are they asking questions? Are they asking the right kinds of questions? Are they paying rapt attention, or are they looking at their phones? Monitoring your audience is going to give you feedback on whether your approach is working or not, and it enables you to change gears if necessary. Tip number 5 is closely related, and that's match your pace to your audience. If people look confused, slow down. If people look bored, try picking up the pace a little bit. If you've already thought about your audience prior to the presentation, you've probably made some assumptions about their knowledge of the material, and you can start at an applicable pace. Then, monitoring their reactions will help to keep you on track. There's a kind of conundrum that we frequently encounter as BAs, where there is a lot of a technology-oriented aspect to the requirements that some less tech-savvy stakeholders might not understand. And we're presenting to mixed audiences of technical and non-technical people. Hillary Mason wrote a great blog post on this, and I've included that blog in the suggested reading materials. She suggests that you start out with the more technical information up front, explaining it to the experts, and then pare it down to more simple concepts for the lay people after that. I think that's a great idea, and I'll encourage you to read that blog post. But I'm just going to caution you not to lose your non-technical audience members while explaining topics to the techies. Okay, tip number 6, strive for conversation, not lecture. Conversations are much more engaging. They're a two-way street. People get involved in them and they pay attention because they have to. Lectures, we've all been through them and they're not as effective, especially when you're trying to get people to review your work. Ask questions. Take questions from the audience. Answer a participant's question and then ask someone on your project team to also weigh in on that. There are a lot of good ways to increase your overall engagement. The only caution is not to lose control of your presentation. After all, you do have a goal to reach. Okay, tip number 7 is important. You don't want to overwhelm people with information. This is important when we're presenting detailed material. If you overwhelm your audience, they'll have a difficult time getting anything out of the discussion. My advice here is threefold, actually. First, focus on a finite number of points. As an example, this section of my lecture has 10 tips. That is by design. I like to work personally with the numbers 3, 7, 10, and 12, but that's just my own personal approach. Don't feel like your audience has to have each one of your 147 requirements memorized, in other words. On the contrary, and this is my second piece of advice, figure out during your planning what you want the audience to walk away with. And then well, I'm obviously focused on my audience. Advice number 3, keep repeating and reiterating those points during the discussion. If you say something 10 times, they're more likely to remember it than if you just mention it once. As an example, how many times have we covered the definition of requirement by now? Don't you have it memorized? It's probably because we covered it 180 times. Okay, tip number 8, convey information with graphics. Okay, so much has been said about this. You know that quote, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's truly a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true, and people don't do it nearly often enough when they're presenting. In writing this course, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to graphically illustrate the concepts we've discussed. But don't just give them data. Well, you can, but it doesn't really count as much as an illustration, right? Try to give them information that conveys meaning along with it. Show them trends. Show them relationships. As an example, let's say we're discussing population trends in New York City's 5 boroughs. Well, which one of these gives them more information? This graphic here or this one? Probably the second, because it paints a very vivid picture. People look at this and say, wow, Manhattan, the blue part, wow, it's only a small percentage of New York's overall population. And that's not something that they might get from just looking at the table on the left. Okay, two more tips. Tip number 9 is to look for opportunities to convey information with anecdotes. Anecdotes are little stories that illustrate concepts for the audience. They're really effective because of their structure. Typically, they have a setup where the background is provided, followed by a dilemma where the problem is conveyed, and then a catharsis or a resolution to the problem. This sounds pretty valuable when we're talking about business analysis, huh? Because we're frequently dealing with situations where we provide some background, then we're talking about problems, and then we're talking about ways to resolve those problems. So anecdotes can fit into business analysis presentations pretty squarely. Okay, and the last tip, tip number 10, is to use humor effectively. Humor is great. It makes people laugh, hopefully. When you have your audience laughing, this helps overcome barriers to communication. It makes hostile audiences a bit less skeptical, and it makes audiences like you a little bit more. When people like you, they are more accepting of your message. So this is all good stuff, and it's important. So go ahead. Use humor in your presentations. There is good reason to. But don't just tell jokes because you feel like you have to. Jokes that distract from your message are to be avoided. Jokes that contribute to your presentation are fantastic. So there are my 10 tips on presenting in general, and I probably have broken every single one of them in my presentation. There are a lot more available on the web. I'll encourage you to check them out. Now let's talk about presenting requirements in particular, and here we're going to shift gears quite a bit and merge the concepts of presentation with the concepts of business analysis that we've been talking about today.